Hi everybody, we're talking about what it means to stand in on our series of what it means to stand in the Bible. We've spoken about standing on, we talked about standing up, now we're talking about standing in. We've spoken about standing in for Jesus, what a place of great privilege we have there. But in Ezekiel chapter 33 we have this Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 30, we have God searching the world, looking for somebody to stand in the gap. And sadly, according to the passage, he could find none. He was looking, but there was none that was able, willing, or capable, or had the experience or the heart to stand in the gap for what God wanted them to do. Now, we also find in the Bible that there are great examples of people who did stand in the gap. We have a look at Noah. Noah stood in the gap at the time when the world really needed him the most. And God looked down and he found one man. He found Noah and he said, "That's my man. He can stand in the gap for me." He looked a little bit later and he found Abraham. And he said, "You're the man that will stand in the gap for me." Later on, in facing Goliath, he's found David who would stand in the gap for him. But you know what, people? It's interesting that these people are a particular type of person. There are certain characteristics of people who stand in the gap that get the attention of God. If you want to stand in the gap for God, you don't just put up your hand and say, "Hey, God, here I am. I want to do this thing. Let me be the man." God says, "Well, let me check you out first to see if you are ready, willing, able, and capable of standing in the gap that I want you to stand in for." So you look at the common threads between all these different great gap stander-inners, and you find that there are certain things that they had by way of preparation. Have a look at Moses, who stood in the gap for God. At the burning bush, God said, "Okay, Moses, you are now ready to stand in the gap for me and to deliver the Israelites from the hands of Pharaoh. You're now ready." So we say, well, what made him ready? What made any gap filler, Nehemiah, Esther, any of those ready? Here's one thing they all had in common. They all understood the place of what we call dead space. Dead space is a place of preparation. Generally, it's a place of solitude, because in solitude, God is able to do some incredible work in you that he could never do while you're standing in the limelight, while you're standing and everybody's listening to you. No. There's a place of dead space that is criteria number one for every gap stander-innerer. Now, dead space looks like this. A couple of aspects of it. First of all, one we'll talk about today is solitude. Solitude is a great place for God to be able to work with you. Moses, 40 years of solitude in the wilderness for God to be able to get Egypt out of Moses before God could say, "Now you're ready to stand in the gap." David, as a child, stood in solitude out there in the fields and in the hills, looking after his sheep day after day, week after week, year after year, while his brothers were claiming the limelight of winning wars and beating up Philistines. And there was David in a place of deep solitude. And yet in that place of solitude, David found that although he was lonely, he knew that he was never alone because God was with him. I speak to a lot of people, don't you, who feel lonely? And I assure every believer that don't be fooled by loneliness, because you are never alone. And in these times of solitude, the times when you think that maybe God has left you, times when you think that maybe God hasn't come through for you, or God's forgotten you, be aware, people, in solitude, God is doing a great work in you that is ultimately going to be a great work through you. It's in these places of solitude that I want to suggest that a couple of things begin to happen. In solitude, we get over ourselves. You know, by general human nature, we kind of got addictions running around all over the place. But most people's basic addiction is with themselves. They're obsessed with who they are. When you're in solitude, as Moses was, there's nobody to impress. You're not trying to prove anything. You haven't got anything to prove. You haven't got anything to lose. You haven't got anything to show. So in the depth of solitude, creeps into your heart a deep desire to know God better, which is the cry of every humble person's heart. I just want to know God. I just want to know Him deeper. I don't want to know people. I know people. People are going to let me down. I program myself for that disappointment. I just want to know who God is. And our obsession with self-esteem, self-worth, self-everything is a place that God cannot use you to be a gap stander in. We got to get over ourselves, people. Hey, man, there's no one of us, man. I battle with this so much. You know, I don't want to deal with myself, put myself to death, crucify myself, offer myself as a living sacrifice. But when you're in solitude and it's just you and God, that becomes that much more a reality and a possibility. God needs us to get over ourselves, and generally this will happen in a place of solitude. I don't know what your place of solitude looks like. Listen, even Jesus, who didn't have to get over himself at all, he had to go through a time of testing. Out of the blessing of the baptism, the first thing the Holy Spirit says, Jesus, we need to prove that we have tested your humanity off to the Mount of Temptation with you. And 40 days of solitude, Jesus was up there and drawing strength from his Father, even though his flesh was crying out and he was hungry, and his mind, and he was saying to himself, I am Jesus, I am the Son of God, I don't deserve this. And God was silent as Jesus worked his way through that period of solitude. So before Jesus could stand in the gap and take the hand of the hurting, take the hand of God and join them together, Jesus had to endure solitude. Kind of like us as well. It's a great thing. One of the great things about solitude is simply that we learn to deal with ourselves. So think about that today. Maybe you're in a place at the moment where you're thinking, man, I kind of feel lonely. Remember, you're never alone. God is with you in those particular times. Want to be a gap filler for God? Then solitude's part of the plan, people, because it creates a deep sense of humility and a greater sense of the awareness of presence of God and our dependence upon Him. Have a great day, you budding gap fillers. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.